Thank you all for joining me for the panel. Our next panel is on Iran, and I'm happy to introduce Ambassador Yong, who will be chairing this panel. Ambassador Yong is Ambassador at Large in the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he is Singapore's non-resident ambassador to Iran. He is concurrently the director of the Institute of Policy Studies in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He was Secretary General of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, from January 2003 to 2008. His diplomatic postings took him to Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, and the US. He was Singapore's ambassador to India and Nepal from 1996 to 1998. He was appointed press secretary to the Prime Minister of Singapore and concurrently held senior positions in the Ministry of Information, Communications, and the Arts and the People's Association in Singapore from 1998 to 2002. He's a graduate of the University of Singapore, and here we have one thing in common in this whole biography, that he's also a graduate of Georgetown University in Washington, where he was a student of Dr. Hudson. In 2008, he was visiting research fellow at the Center on Contemporary Central Asia and the Caucasus in the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. So, if you can please take control of the panel. Thank you, Ambassador Yong.
Thank you, Rana, for that kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have a very stimulating conference in the past day and a half. I'm sure this panel will be even more exciting. We ensure that all firecrackers have been boxed up, so we are just going to have good intellectual exchange of views on what is happening in the Gulf, especially in Iran. I thought I should not waste too much of the time. Let us listen to the panelists first, and then we can have a bit of discussion, and maybe at that point I can also add some of my own comments. So, as you can see in your brochure, the first speaker is Mr. Dr. Huang Ko, and his biographical background is already in your booklet. I just wish to say that I first met Professor Ko 2 years back when he visited Singapore, and I'm very happy to welcome him back here again. At that time when he came, he spoke at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we were all very impressed with his knowledge and ability to tell us what are the key issues that we need to know in the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf region. So currently he's teaching at the University of Michigan, and we look forward to hearing from Dr. Ko. Professor, please.
Well, thank you very much for the warm introduction. It's always a great pleasure to be in Singapore. I want to thank MEI and Professor Hudson for the warm invitation to be here. My charge is to talk about challenges and opportunities for Iran in the new Middle East. And I think those that's a wide-ranging subject. There are many of both. With regard to opportunities, there's obviously here now an opportunity for Iran to have better relations with the Central Arab countries, especially Egypt. The Hosni Mubarak regime was almost irrationally afraid of Iran. It had a kind of almost war footing with Iran, and had been involved in the FAO campaign, in lending Saddam Hussein officers to help with strategy in the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s. Hosni Mubarak famously said that he thought that Arab Shiites were more loyal to Iran than to their own countries. So the new government in Egypt, which is more open to the influence of Egyptian public opinion, and opinion polling shows that only 6% or so of the Arab publics are worried about Iran. the new government, the military regime of Tantawi, has announced that it's going to open an embassy in Tehran, that there will be flights between Cairo and Tehran, and some of that, as I said, almost irrational fear of Iran is subsiding. I spoke at the Egyptian Foreign Ministry last year this time to a group of young diplomats, and they asked me about Iran, and I said, well, it seems to me that Iran in the Middle East is mainly about supporting some of its clients and getting a better deal in their own nation. So, I mean, it plays a role with Hezbollah in Lebanon. It plays a role with the Shiites in Bahrain and so forth, but it's a relatively minor role, and it's not an aggressive one, as Iran hasn't invaded anybody in a very long time. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials in Egypt were a little bit taken aback and wanted to know exactly how much the Iranians were paying me to say these things. But that's the way I see it. And the model of secular Arab nationalism, which has dominated the Arab world, or many of the countries in the Arab world for so long, is an alternative model to that of Iran, which is all about, well, at least its stated ideology is all about challenging modern nationalism in favor of Islamic identity. In the Bahrain crisis, Iran faces some opportunities in becoming the protector of the Shiites of the Arab world from a new, more assertive, more aggressive Saudi Arabia, which sent troops into Bahrain to help put down a disproportionately Shiite reform movement. As a result, it is said at least that Nouri al-Maliki, who, you know, being from the Dawa party in Iraq and a more lay kind of Muslim politician, had not been that close to Tehran. Imam Talabani once joked that he was closer to Iran than Maliki was. But since the Saudis went into Bahrain, it is said that, that relations between Baghdad and Tehran have warmed up because the Iraqi Shia feel that growing Saudi and frankly militantly Sunni influence. Because of the Arab Spring, because of the turmoil in Egypt and Syria, Israel's borders are no longer to be taken for granted. There's turmoil on all sides of Israel, and so the luxury that the Likud government of Benjamin Netanyahu had of thinking about or talking about, you know, striking at Iran or encouraging a strike on Iran and so forth has much declined. And so I think the Israelis can't think in a more wide regional way strategically at a time when they have to worry what's going to happen in Cairo and Damascus. And so that's, I think, taken pressure off of Iran. And then Iran has fond hopes that some of the Muslim fundamentalist parties in the countries that have experienced political turmoil will eventually come out on top, and that there will be room for more Iranian interfacing with those groups than there had been with the Hosni Mubarak types. That particular hope strikes me as a little forlorn, but that's, if you read the Iranian politicians' speeches and the clerics' sermons, that's the kind of thing that they say. The challenges for Iran are also great. The Saudi intervention in the Bahrain crisis, the crushing of the Wafaq party, which now all of its delegates to the lower house have resigned and the resignations have been accepted. Really the destruction of politics among the Shia majority of Bahrain has created a crisis in the Gulf that is challenging Iran. A lot of Iranian politicians and clerics have wanted to take a very hard line on what has happened in Bahrain. The Speaker of the House, Larijani, has threatened Saudi Arabia, has said that a thing like that won't go unpunished. There have been clerics who have talked about getting up a flotilla to treat Bahrain under the Sunnis as Gaza under the Israelis. And the notion of an Iranian flotilla to Bahrain sent frisson of fear and concern throughout the Gulf region. The Sunnis of Iraq I think, took a certain amount of hope from the Saudi assertiveness. There have been a lot of demonstrations in Mosul demanding the U.S. get out now, not at the end of the year, that it get out altogether, that al-Maliki released the Sunni young men who are in the thousands in Iraqi jails. And I think my own analysis of it is, and this is a little bit speculative, I admit, that some of the Mosul elite that voted for al-Hadwa and the kind of Sunni Arab nationalism are signaling to the Saudis that they're there. Iran's ally in the Levant, Syria, has been weakened by its own turmoil. That's obviously a demerit for Iran. And therefore, also, Hezbollah somewhat weakened because of its dependence on Syrian support. And NATO intervention in Libya has the potential to create pro-American sentiments. Certainly, we've seen the people in Benghazi waving the American flags with the wrong number of stars, but still, you know, the sentiment is there, is, I think, very unwelcome in Tehran. Iran's leadership at least says that it sees this Arab Spring, these movements, as Islamic. And so leader Ali Khamenei said, thanks to Islam and the Islamic Revolution, a public Islamic awakening has happened in the region today. Others have talked about this being an echo of 1979 in the region. And I have to say, this way of looking at what has happened strikes me as simply incorrect. They may know it's incorrect, and they are nevertheless attempting to depict it in this way for their own purposes. But the crowds in Tahrir Square were chanting nationalist slogans. They were talking about the people, Shab, and the Watan, the nation. I'd never heard anybody talk about the Ummah or the wider Islamic community in Tahrir Square. So I think that this way of looking at what has happened is, as I said, incorrect. Not to say that in Derna in Libya or in Mbaba in Egypt or in some parts of Syria that the Muslim Brotherhood or Muslim fundamentalist groups haven't had a role. But the leading edge of these movements seems to me to be more populist and secular. The Iranians, as I said, were extremely upset by the Saudi sending of 1,000 troops into Bahrain. Ayatollah Ahmadinejad, the chair of the Guardian Council, said that the Bahraini Shia had taken a leaf from the other revolts, but that it was suddenly asked. The Bahrain government suddenly asked Saudi Arabia and the UAE to support it with their troops. He said no international rule or regulation allows this, and roundly denounced it. The Iranian positions on Libya strike me as all over the map and self-contradictory. On the whole and by and large, Iranian politicians and clerics have said that they support these popular revolts against their dictatorial governments. And of course, with regard to Libya in particular, most of you may know that Muammar al-Gaddafi, the dictator in Libya, had played a role in Lebanon in the late 70s and had intervened against the budding Shia movement in Lebanon, which was in conflict at that time with the Palestinians, and had invited Musa Sadr, the man really of Iranian extraction who had organized the Lebanese Shia, to Tripoli. And Musa Sadr never came back from that trip. He's the Jimmy Hoffa of the Middle East. He's disappeared. I think we should look for him somewhere in that nice stadium in Tripoli and the foundations. But Gaddafi had him killed and then had him disappeared. So the Shia in Lebanon hate Gaddafi because Musa Sadr is their political George Washington, and the Iranians take a cue from that. So they dislike Gaddafi, and they said that Janati, for instance, condemned Gaddafi for attacking his own people when they revolted. But on the other hand, the Iranian regime has been very much against the NATO intervention. And Janati, by the way, praised the UNSC resolution for a no-fly zone, but the foreign ministry now says it views the intervention in Libya as a violation of international law. This, again, is not true, but that's what they say. And it seems to me that you can't support the Libyan rebels if you also think that they should have been killed by Gaddafi's tanks. And this seems to me to be the contradiction in the Iranian stance. There has been a big focus in Iranian discourse on American hypocrisy. And so the fact that the U.S. was willing to become part of the coalition that intervened in Libya is thrown in Washington's face because at the same time they more or less acquiesced in the intervention to crush the movement in Bahrain. Tehran itself, however, has a problem public relations-wise in the Arab world that publics see Iran as hypocritical for saying nothing about Syrian crushing of its protest movement. There's been deafening silence from Tehran on that issue, but being very exercised about Bahrain. And it makes it look as though if a Shiite-tinged regime like the Alawite-dominated Ba'ath in Syria crushes protesters, that's all right. But if Sunnis crush Bahraini Shiite protesters, that's not all right, which means that Iran's stance is viewed as sectarian and not principled. And to the extent that Iran can get any purchase in the Arab world, it has to be on the basis of principle. If it's viewed as only pursuing a sectarian objective, then obviously the majority of the Arab world is Sunni and will mind. But Iran does see what has happened as a generally good thing in the sense that it almost certainly portends less strong U.S. hegemony over the Middle East, more popular input, and the Iranians believe that that's good for them. And so President Ahmadinejad believed that the new Middle East will be formed without the U.S. and its allies, by which he means primarily Israel. However, of course, that removal of the U.S. from the scene is a little unlikely. The new Egyptian government in Egypt is dominated still by officers who got trained at Fort Bragg and so forth. So I would argue that the Iranian response to all this has been more or less a realist response. It has responded in terms of its interests as a regional hegemon. And so where its ally Syria was threatened by popular uprisings, it's silent about that, or even it is accused of helping to repress them. Where its interests are improved, as in Egypt, it's been all for the protests, and where, as in Libya, its interests were in seeing Gaddafi removed, it supported the rebels, but it perceived its interest to be damaged by a Western intervention in Libya, and so it condemned that. So it ended up condemning both parties in the conflict. And I think that if you look at the Iranian stance as welling out of its perceived interests as a regional hegemon, as a realist foreign policy rather than as an idealistic one, that actually the various contradictions here make a certain amount of sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ko. Well, the next speaker is Dr. Mahmood Sariolghalam from Tehran. He is from the University of Shahid Beheshti University in Tehran. And we are very happy to welcome him to Singapore for his participation in this conference. I think I will let him speak now, and then maybe we can do a bit more interaction with him later during our panel discussion. Professor, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Yong, and thank you, Professor Hudson and the Middle East Institute team for inviting me to this conference. I'd like to focus on two ideas in speaking about Iran's foreign policy. First, I'd like to argue that Iran's foreign policy since 1979 has been characterized by a set of fixations, and they have been overly consistent throughout time. And second, I'd like to argue that Iran's national resources and its political and economic power have basically been used to maintain the country's territorial integrity and also in defense of its ideological polity. Iran has basically not been able to use its national resources for its domestic purposes, for national economic and social development. And in the end, I would provide you with some ideas about the future of Iran's foreign policy and also how its domestic structure may change in the coming decade or so. Now, on the first idea of fixations, from day one in 1979, after the revolution, Iran was very clear that the purpose of the revolution is not economic development. And it's not to change the nature of the Iranian economy. They did focus on policies of redistribution, but engaging the world was not the purpose of the Iranian Revolution. If you look at the exact time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, that's when the Chinese began to enter the world. So the globalization policy of China is in contrast to the policy of indigenization of Iran. So when the world began to globalize and much of the developing countries in Asia, Middle East, and Latin America began to globalize, Iran was a country, because of its history, which I will come back later, it focused on its domestic structure and very clearly announced that indigenization, self-reliance, some of the policies of the African countries in the 1960s were actually the national policies of Iran. Although over the years, in the last 30 years, the style of Iranian diplomacy, the vocabulary that Iran has used, even the number of discourses within Iran and outside of Iran have changed. But the essential policies of Iran towards the outside world have remained very consistent. For example, Iran's preference for liberation movements, Iran's preference for resistance movements have always been vivid in contrast to fostering relations with governments at the regional level. There has been an institutionalized confrontation with the United States and Israel. Third, Iran has fostered strategic enclaves in the Middle East to contain the United States. So in other words, as the U.S. has developed a strategy of containment towards Iran in different phases over the last 30 years, Iran in response, has also developed a strategy of containing the United States for its own political survival. Fourthly, foreign economic relations of Iran have always been separate and separable from its foreign policy pursuits. You look at a country like South Korea or even Turkey within Iran's neighborhood, how they have linked their foreign policy to their economic policies, that has been very distinct when we speak about Iran. Next is the supremacy of ideological interests over economic ones in maintaining domestic security in Iran. In elaborating on these fixations in Iran's foreign policy, I'd like to focus on 4 ideas. One is that the sovereignty of the country in the post-revolutionary period has basically meant that it should maintain a strategic distance from the United States because of the history of Iranian-American relations. So in a way, the configuration of power within Iran has been fixated on a distance with the United States. I have argued over the years that Iran cannot normalize relations with the United States because normalization with the US would mean that its domestic political structure would have to change, or domestic political configuration has to be altered. And I will touch upon that in my conclusion. So then the political sovereignty of this revolutionary structure needs to be maintained and cultivated on an anti-American sentiment. Second, the legitimacy of the state needs to be also related to its anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism, and anti-Israeli policies. Power in Iran is a zero-sum game, as we also heard about Iraq. So if political groups entertain the idea that we need some new approach to the United States, they would have to leave the political scene. Over the years, all governments during the 1990s and early 2000s, all governments that try to have a different definition of Iranian-American relations, or they try to look at the U.S. from a different perspective, they all failed. And I think there have been so many attempts in Iran over the last especially 15 years to break out of these fixations, and they have all failed. The Rafsanjani government for 8 years tried to link economic policy to foreign policy, and he failed. The Khatami government tried to focus on a different approach and a rapprochement with the West. He also failed. And I think even the current government in its second term has tried in many, many ways to try to have a different definition of foreign policy, and it has also failed. And that is because of a lack of consensus on a new definition of sovereignty and legitimacy within the state. And that leads us to the third idea about fixations, and that is the confrontation between ideological and internationalist groups in Iran. From day one, just like perhaps many other revolutions of our age, there has been two orientations within Iran. An ideological one, which has always had a very strong constitutional backing, and with many security and military institutions of the state linked to this ideological approach. And then the internationalist approach, those who focus on national economic development and also policies of globalization, engaging the world and having Iran develop in terms of its social, economic, and other values that it might have. So the confrontation between ideology and internationalism in Iranian foreign policy has always been present, and there's always been clashes within the elite groups. And the fourth idea about fixation is that Iran's economy has never been an internationalized economy. From day one, Iran focused on the ideas of self-reliance. Though Iran's trade has fundamentally been with 5 countries in Europe and China in Asia, but there has been very little technological transfer, capital flows into the country, and also a real engagement with the international economy. That is, of course, due to the sanctions, partly, but also because there has been a genuine policy of focusing on internal resources. So at a time when, for example, Turkey has flourished in the last 2 decades, Iran's economy has focused on internal resources and in many ways misuse of national resources for political purposes. For example, when we compare Iran to South Korea, Iran with exports of $25 billion compared to some $800 billion of South Korea. So the country, in terms of technology and economic development, has suffered tremendously. There's been this obsession that we do not need to engage the world because then we would lose our political sovereignty. Now, I think when we look at the second proposition I proposed in the beginning, that Iran's national resources have basically been focused on maintaining its territorial integrity in the first decade of the revolution vis-à-vis the war it had with Iraq, and later on to maintain the system. So the strategy of survival has always had supremacy over any other strategy in the country. And the country has not been able to use its national resources to solve problems of unemployment, to stop the brain drain, and to build a reliable infrastructure, despite the fact that Iran has earned some $1,000 billion in the aftermath of the revolution. Now, some ideas about where Iran is moving, given these fixations and how the national economic resources have been misused. I think at a macro level of discussion, this is a reflection of the conflict between tradition and modernity in Iran. Since 1895, more than a century, Iranians have not been able to reach a consensus on their identity. There has been no social contract in Iran. And I can stretch my imagination and think that perhaps in a decade or so, how Iranians are going to be moving away from ideology, because it is again, it is the ramification of this obsession with ideology over the last 30 years. The society is so divided on what it wants to be, where it wants to go, and how it defines its historical legacy. I have often annoyed my Iranian colleagues, both inside and outside of the country, by saying that Iran is not a nation state. Whereas Turkey is becoming a nation state, India and China are nation states, and Brazil is a nation state now, but Iran is in the process of becoming a nation state in a very devastating and a very arduous way. Maybe Iran has had a tradition of a long centralized state and empire, but as a nation state, it is a very new concept. The strategy of survival has dominated the way the elites in Iran have defined their national purposes. We can be optimistic and say that the conflict in Iran is over ideas, is over ideology, is over a definition of identity. But we can be Hobbesian and say that the real conflict is over power and over maintaining a power. As I said, because the game of politics in Iran is a zero-sum game, if those who believe in ideology try to compromise with those who believe in internationalism, they would have to leave the political scene. So there is no compromising ground on defining statecraft and a national strategy. So if we move to a post-ideology Iran, I think Iran is going to focus on its economy. It has to. I think Iran has very, very few alternatives as we move forward. The generation that is ruling Iran today is over 70 years old, which reminds me of the Soviet Union in the 1980s and perhaps China in the early 1970s. So I think the resolution of the question of identity and strategy for Iran is also a generational issue as we move forward. And I think that much of what Iran does at the regional level is for its own national survival, rather than as how the conventional wisdom is in much of the region or in the world, that Iran is an expansionist state. Maybe in the 1980s, Iran's strategy of reaching out to Lebanon and the Palestinian groups was an ideological pursuit. But today, I think Iran's approach to Lebanon and the Palestinian issue is basically a component of its strategy of containment, of containing the United States. In the post-ideological era of Iran, I think Iran would definitely be a powerful country, but it will be an economically powerful country. And with its linkages to Iraq and the region, it will foster economic and social relations rather than ideological and security domination of the region. Afghanistan, Lebanon, Palestinian groups will no longer be a national priority of Iran, I think, in the post-ideological era in the Iranian foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmood. Now we feature the third speaker. He is from the Republic of Korea, Dr. Jeongmin Seoul. Dr. Seoul. He teaches at the Hankuk University of Foreign Affairs, but he is currently chair of the Department of Middle East and Africa at the School of International Area Studies, Graduate School of International Area Studies in Hankuk University. Dr. Seoul, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Professor Hudson, for your kind invitation to Singapore. It's kind of a shame, you know, this is my first time to be in Singapore as a Southeast, you know, East Asian, you know, some citizen. While I was living in the Middle East more than 12 years, working in journalism. So anyway, so today my topic is oh, yes, okay. So on Iran, but, you know, so I'm not, you know, dealing, you know, directly the case of Iranian nuclear issue, but I want to focus on the Arab reaction to this issue. So whenever we talk about Iranian issue, one of the hottest issues in the Middle East, so we have two major presumptions. First one is Iran is actively seeking to make a nuclear bomb, and second is Iran is moving towards a hegemonic power center in the region. But I do believe some Iran's nuclear program and its attempts to create the so-called Shia crescent that have brought a new political ideological rivalry in the region. Not one-way threat from Iran, but some kind of interactive rivalry between Iran and the surrounding Arab world. So that's why I do believe Arab reaction should be dealt with to understand the interactions between the two powers. So that's why I analyzed some Arab media. So basically Al-Sharq al-Awsat, the opinion sections between 2005 to 2010. So I have some divided all the articles related to Iran in that opinion section into 4 thematic categories. The first one is how the articles define the Iran's nuclear program and Shia crescent and the terms used to describe them. Second, how they interpreted the reasons and intentions behind the Iran's nuclear program. Third, how they evaluated the consequences of the Iran's initiatives, the solutions suggested by them to solve the problem of that issue. The result of my some research are following. Table 1 shows the sheer number of articles which appear in the opinion sections of the Al-Sharq al-Awsat newspaper and contain the word of Iran, and then indicates the growing interest of Arab media increased dramatically between the year 2005 and the year 2010. If you look at some 2010, there's 256 articles they talked about Iran. And then 2009 some relatively is some small number of articles because of the so-called financial crisis, the declaration of Dubai's moratorium. So the media focused more on the economy issues in that region. But in 2010, there's new sanctions, imposed by Security Councils in June, and then there's another, some U.S. comprehensive Iran sanctions made at that year. So there's a lot of interest in Arab media on the Iranian issue. The first, I want to define how some Arab media define the Iranian nuclear issue. So I analyzed, I counted some of the terms used to describe the Iranian nuclear program were Shia crescent. This table 2 indicates the most some frequently mentioned the terms designating Iranian threat is that they describe the Iranian nuclear issue as a threat. So occupying almost 32% of all 906 articles. And for example, Ahmad al-Rabai, an Egyptian columnist, mentioned in his article titled "Iran and the Language of Threat and Intimidation," he said, Iran has gone back to the use of threatening and intimidating rhetoric when addressing her neighbors. And then second, the term which has been some frequently used is the ambition, so which means Iran's intention to be a regional superpower was frequently used by the authors of the article in the opinion section, occupying 19%. This definition represented the second largest preferred term used by the authors. For example, in his article titled "Who Seeks to Hinder the Damascus Summit?", Tariq al-Humaid, the editor-in-chief of Al-Sharq al-Awsat, describes the Ahmadinejad's regime never hesitates to play all its cards in the region at a time when Arabs are striving to bridge the differences. So, another perception of Iran's nuclear initiatives was expressed by the articles as a danger. So 112 articles mention the term danger, occupying 16% of all articles. The article, the title, The Iranian Casino, is one of the best examples. The author of this article, Hossein Shobokshi, a Jordanian businessman and prominent columnist, argues that Iran's dangerous game is a gamble, and is not an adventure. And then finally, intimidation and ascendancy of Iranian power were sometimes found in the same articles in the opinion section, occupying relatively similar percentages with 12% and 11% respectively. Intimidation is a stronger expression of threat, and ascendancy is a more ideology-oriented denotation of Sunni-Shia rivalry. With the use of these terms, the columnists of Ash-Sharq al-Awsat tried to emphasize that Iranian nuclear development may cause an imminent threat to the neighboring countries or a future engagement of Shia masses leaving the adjacent Sunni states. The next one is, so I analyzed the reasons behind the Iranian nuclear program and Shia crescent, and then around some of the 437 the news articles were collected from the opinion sections in the newspaper, and then from this article that I have surveyed, the following four main reasons the Iran's nuclear development are: the ambition to be a hegemonic power in the region, religious fervor, attaining nuclear weapons, and confronting US and Israel. The most popular explanation for Iran's nuclear initiatives expressed by the Arab authors was Iran's ambition to be a hegemonic power in the region. In more than 47% of the same sample articles, this reason was mentioned. For example, a Sudanese columnist, Said Wild Abba, in his article titled Iran Threat or Model, contends that the repeated hints made by Iranian president with regards to the membership of his country to the nuclear club have shaken the Arab world despite the attempts to cover this up with diplomatic language. The second most frequently mentioned reason for the Iranian nuclear ambition was religious fervor, occupying 18% of the total articles. It is interesting that the Arab authors are likely to emphasize the religious interpretation, perceiving the Iranian nuclear issue as a Shia political initiative. For example, a Saudi journalist and expert on Islamic movements, the Mashri Ajzaid, points out, what I am referring to is the audacious manipulation of Khomeini's Iran of all Shia followers around the world with the intention of attaching them to pure Iranian interest under holy slogans about al-Hussein's blood and the symbolism of Karbala. Exalted slogans that evoke religious sentiments become provocative and rebellious and ultimately only serve the interest of the Iranian political agenda. Another explanation invoked by the newspaper articles for the Iranian nuclear development was Iran's intention to attain nuclear weapons. Although this subcategory of reasons represented a small portion of the same sample articles, occupying only 10%, some analysts points out that Iran's nuclear initiatives is serious and actual move to make a nuclear warhead. For example, Abdurrahman al-Rashid, the general manager of Al Arabiya television, mentioned in his article titled On Iranian in Space and Iranians on Earth that billions of dollars have been spent on producing and protecting nuclear weapons in Iran. And as for the confronting nature of the Iranian nuclear issue, which appeared in many Western news media, the intellectuals and journalists in the Arab world did not mention it frequently. Nevertheless, some intellectuals say that Iran, especially its president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, has verbally instigated Israel and the US. In the article titled The Day of American Sunk Khomeini's Navy, Amir Taheri, an Iranian journalist and scholar, emphasized that, in that sense, the Islamic Republic has been at war with the U.S. since 4th November 1979 and continues to inflict losses on its American enemies wherever possible, notably in Afghanistan and Iraq. The third, oh, sorry. Oh, there's one is missing. Okay, so how can, some of the Arab media, evaluate the consequences of the Iranian nuclear program? So one of the, some of the main themes which were frequently mentioned in the articles of the opinion section was the consequences of the Iranian nuclear initiatives. The authors of the articles illustrated various negative effects of the Iranian nuclear development and expansion of the so-called Shia political bloc. According to 304 articles which mention the effects of the Iranian issue, the negative consequences can be summarized into 5 main areas: destabilizing the region, weakening the regional solidarity, nuclear proliferation in the region, inviting foreign involvement, and possible regional war. The most negative consequence of the Iranian nuclear development, which concerned the Arab intellectuals and journalists, is destructive effects on the stability and security of the region. The 151 out of the 304 sample articles pointed out its danger to the regional stability. For example, Abdul Aziz Saghir, the chairman of Gulf Research Center based in the United Arab Emirates, mentioned in his article titled "Difficult Issue on Iran Threat," what Iran has done and is still doing are widening the Palestinian chasm, disrupting stability in Iraq, continuing its occupation of the islands that belong to the UAE, threatening the Gulf security and interfering in internal Arab affairs through its support of Hezbollah, and supporting Syria's position which threatens Lebanon's stability and its disruption in Iraq. The second most serious consequence of Iran's nuclear issue was its negative effects on the regional solidarity. 16% of the sample articles pointed out the political and ideological influence of Iran's initiatives on the Arab politics. A Lebanese journalist, Adil Darwish, contends, as soon as the Syrian-Iranian acquisition battle over Lebanon ends, the next battle will be to establish the support pillars for taking over Iraq. Everything will collapse. Such is the gravity of Syria's actions that this is the imminent threat that looms over the region. Syria does not support Arab unity, rather, it supports Iran's reckless sword. The Arab intellectuals and journalists argue that the Iranian initiative have also resulted in the proliferating nuclear facilities in the region. Although the frequency of this argument was not very high, accounting for 13% of the total, many Arab thinkers and analysts have expressed their concern and suspicion on this issue. For example, Huda al-Husseini, in her article of Consequences of a Nuclear Middle East, she explains the concern. The problem in Iran lies with the regime, since it became nuclear enabled, or if it was believed to possess nuclear arsenal, then the immediate consequences will be that Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey will obtain nuclear weapons as well. Then Libya and Syria will start their own nuclear programs, and the Middle East will become nuclear zone. The consequences of inviting foreign involvement or possible regional war also mentioned by some articles, although only 17 articles out of the total 304 examples dealt with these consequences. These articles contained an important strategic message extending the Iranian nuclear threat to the international field. The Arab intellectuals and journalists intended to warn the international community against the threat and ultimately to gain international support in Arabs' responses. Okay, so final one is, what kind of, some suggestions have been suggested by Arab intellectuals? As can be seen from table 5, sorry. Yes. The mainly 4 solutions were suggested. First, dialogue. Second, diplomatic isolation. Third, helping regime change. Finally, military actions. It is worth noting that only 148 out of the 1,112 articles which mention the term Iran contain some suggestions to solve the problems. This indicates that Iranian nuclear issue is too complex and complicated to find a straightforward solution. The most, some frequently suggested solution is dialogue. The absolute majority of the sample articles, 75%, was dedicated to this solution, as a lot of political analysts have long regarded dialogue with Iran as one of the best solutions to political conflicts. And many writers and journalists in the opinion section also emphasize the necessity of dialogue with Iran in order to put an end to confrontation. With the exception of the first solution, the other three can be described as stick policies because the main purpose of these policies is to remove the threat from Iran either diplomatically, politically, and militarily. The less coercive response among the three is a tactics of diplomatic isolation. The 12% of the total sample articles accounted for these diplomatic measures. For example, Diana Mukhalid, a Lebanese journalist, points out that this measure in her article titled Containing Iran, she said, Iran should be contained, not provoked. We cannot deny its influence on the whole region. There are Shia in Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman. There is Hezbollah in Lebanon. It is best to forge an agreement with those that we cannot confront. Some Arab intellectuals and journalists also suggest a political interference in Iran's domestic politics, helping Iranian opposition to change the regime. The proponents of this solution stressed on international cooperation. For example, in his article, Prelude to War, Amir Tahiri contends, removing Ahmadinejad from power is not easy. However, regimes that lack domestic mechanisms for policy change are bound to have change imposed on them by external force. Finally, a small number of the sample articles, only 3%, perceive military measures as one of the inevitable responses to Iran's nuclear initiative. For example, Hamad al-Majid, as Saudi journalist argues, Ahmadinejad's regime never hesitated to play all its cards in the region, so more coercive measures would be necessary if Iran continued its pursuit of a nuclear arsenal. So if I conclude, Iran's nuclear program has brought a new political ideological rivalry between Iran and other Arab countries. The Arab elites have been more concerned about the Iranian and Shia influence on the average people in the region. This has brought the phenomenon, so Arab media and politicians sometimes exaggerate the emergence of an ideological Shiite crescent as something violent and destructive. So this Arab perception has caused a nuclear renaissance in the region as a political response. So if we go back to this, the diagram, I have, some categorized 11, countries which have declared, the nuclear development and during the last several years. So, only, some Jordan and UAE at the bottom, they are conducting nuclear development on the basis of their economic need, and then the other countries they have rather, they have more some concerns on security and political issues rather than some imminent economic need. The best example is ABC, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. They have more the intention. That they have more, they have more intention to, declare, some nuclear developments to say that, on the basis of their political and security reasons. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Xiu. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have heard all the three panelists. We did not plan that Dr. Koh speak the shortest of the three speakers, and Dr. Seoul speak the most of the three speakers, but as their flow of presentation goes, this is how it is now. But we are now in the open session, and first I saw this hand over this side, and then we come back to the middle. Yes, the gentleman at the back first, and then the lady. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for the...
Please speak louder.
Okay. Thank you for the nice presentation. And my name is Marwan Ghazawi. I'm from Lebanon. I just want to ask a question. Why some countries are allowed to have nuclear weapons while others, you know, they're not allowed to have? And why don't we talk about Israel? Isn't Israel one of the reasons for catalyzing Iran to have nuclear weapons in the first place? And also, I want to talk about hypocrisy, because Professor Mahmood or Dr. Mahmood said that Iran is consistent when it comes to foreign policy. How about Watergate? And how about the support for the Americans when they invaded Iraq and other things? So superficially, yes, it has been consistent. That means they have endorsed the resistance and the liberation movements. But if you go to the small details, then the devil lies in the details. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For our panelists, I want to collect maybe every time 3 questions before we come back to you. So that's the first question. Next, the lady, and then we go back to the center here.
Hi, I actually have 2 questions. My first question is for Dr. Sariolghalam. I read a few papers written by Karim Sajjadpour. He's a policy analyst in the US, and he sees enmity with the US as very central to Iran's self-definition, but he sees it as located mainly in Khamenei and not with Rafsanjani and the rest of the parliament in Tehran. But from your talk, it seems that the centrality of enmity to the US enjoys a much wider base in the structural configuration of power. But could one argue, however, that the failure of an Iranian-US rapprochement during the Rafsanjani and Khatami eras, as in it lay mainly on the US, as in the American side at the time, and that things might be changing now given Obama's Nowruz speech, where he addressed the Iranian people directly, and as well as some other unprecedented overtures. And my second question is to all the panelists. I wanted to ask about the US-Iranian relations. How important is engagement with the US for Iran? Does Iran need to? On an economic level, trade with China is increasing. I think it hit a high this January. And I read somewhere that South Korea closed a few of their banks in Tehran, but while I was there last year, I saw big billboards advertising for LG and Samsung. So, and on a political level, it seems that the US might, as an overstretched empire, needs good relations with Iran more than Iran needs them, but I'm not sure. So I hope to hear comments on this from all the panelists. Thank you.
You have given us a very broad canvas to respond. This gentleman at the back.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is to Professor Juan Cole. If what's happening in the Arab world is viewed as 1848 for the Arab world, why Iran will be immune to this change? So one of the challenges is not only opportunity, but this might have a fallout on political fallout in Iran. Iran itself might face similar. Second, revolutions tend to produce strong states, very assertive in their foreign relation. And you are a historian, you know, France, Russia, China, and Iran itself produce strong states that are very assertive in this foreign policy. So if the revolution takes its all extent, I mean, it becomes a revolutionary state in Egypt, it'll become more assertive. And then, in this case, might give competition to Iran in different fields. I mean, if you see the Mubarak regime towards the end was basically withdrawn from all regional issue, whether it's Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, and the Gulf security. So you will have an Egypt that is more assertive after the revolution. My third question is regarding the nuclear issues. I'm not sure, by the way, that the Sharq al-Awsat is quite representative. Some people might think it's tendentious when it comes to Iran. So, you know, this is not actually quite representative. But there is one issue I never got an answer to, one issue regarding the Iranian nuclear weapons. The U.S. National Intelligence Estimate of 2007 says that there is no military program. But what happened since 2007 that makes the United States believe that Iran is pursuing a military program? Thank you.
All right. Maybe we start off with, just hold on the rest of you with questions. We take the response from the panelists first. Maybe we go by the same order that we start. Dr. Ko?
Sure. Well, with regard to the revolutions producing stronger governments, I think that's not always true. Popular uprisings can produce weak governments in some instances, and we've seen that sometimes in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. And of course, there's a question about whether what happened in places like Tunisia and Egypt are really revolutions. So far, some wags have suggested that the people have managed to produce military coups in each of these countries, and we don't know where they're going from that. I would say Egypt's military and foreign policy stance has certainly been weakened by the popular disturbances. And I think behind the scenes, although Egypt seemed as though it was somewhat withdrawn from regional affairs, actually it had been a strong support for Saudi security. It played a role behind the scenes, both in fighting al-Qaeda and in curbing Iran. In a way, there was an Egyptian military umbrella over the Gulf that was subsidiary to the American one. So I think that from the point of view, certainly of someone like King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, what's happened is that Egypt has been much weakened in all of these dimensions, and that moreover the new influence of popular opinion on government policy has caused Egypt to back off its previous security commitments with regard to Gulf security. And in fact, the Egyptian foreign minister recently made a tour of the Gulf region and had to say, well, you know, it's not that we're like throwing the GCC countries under the bus in reaching out to Iran, but that was how it was often perceived there. So I think that there's a real sea change here, and that the days when Cairo could be depended upon to be a bulwark for Saudi and American security interests vis-a-vis Iran are drawing to a close.
Dr. Mahmood, any response?
Yeah. In 2007 and 2008, there were 3 rounds of negotiations between Iran and the United States in Baghdad. And as Americans made it clear that they are interested in going beyond Iraqi security in their negotiations with Iran, Iran began to withdraw from the negotiations because they realized, as they have known over time, that if there's going to be a genuine Iranian-American rapprochement, the number one issue is going to be Iranian definition of Israel and Iranian involvement in Levant. And that's an issue that Iran is not prepared at the moment to change. So by this example, I'd like to demonstrate to you that there are limits to what degree Iran is willing to negotiate and engage the United States. There have been many, many overtures by the Americans, and there's been Iranian willingness right after 2003 to talk to the Americans, but it's all been short of normalization and serious regional discussions. I think the 1953 coup, economic differences, Afghanistan, Iraq are not serious issues vis-a-vis the two countries. The fundamental issue that divides Iran and the United States is the issue of Israel. And There is very strong ideological, bureaucratic inertia within Iran not to discuss that particular element of Iranian-American relations. There was a time in the early 1990s no one could speak about Iranian-American relations within Iran. That is no longer a taboo, but Israel does remain a taboo within Iran. And so I think you can find many other examples over the last 20 years where Iran and the US have talked to each other. They have had meetings over other issues like Afghanistan, Iraq, but not on bilateral relations. And I think that is going to remain so as long as we have, I think I called it a generational kind of approach to Iranian foreign policy.
Thank you. Dr.
Yes. The first question on why we don't deal with the case of Israel whenever we talk about the nuclear issues in the Middle East. Yes, you're right. The Israel's nuclear issue is very important. But so whenever if we deals with Israel's nuclear the issue is kind of related to international law or some international politics. But I do want to focus on the Arab and Middle East politics. So that's why I intentionally exclude case of Israel. So when I'm dealing with the nuclear issues in the Middle East, and then so about the Iran's importance in the world politics, for example, some South Korea, we a lot, the public opinion, and then almost all entrepreneurs and business circle opposed, some last year's unilateral sanctions on Iran. So, but there's some international pressure to do that. So, many some Korean analysts believe that the unilateral sanctions started June last year from the United States and joined by the European Union, Australia, and Japan. Is not a good the strategy toward Iran. I know the Iranian the policies against Iran in the United States and other Western countries is very psychological sometimes, is very political, but in terms of economy, so after the unilateral sanctions from about more than 30 countries to Iran, so there's a very strong bilateral relation we are now witnessing between China and Iran. So in the long run, I think the U.S. policy and other Western countries unilateral sanctions over Iran will strengthen the bilateral relationship between China and the Iran. It means I may say we are handing over Iran to China in the future. Russia too. Yeah, and Russia too. So in the long run, so nowadays we are witnessing the G2, the world politics, and then the Iran is so important strategically, geopolitically, and economy in terms of energy. But we are totally handing over Iran to China. In the 20 years later, I don't think we do have some of the positive consequences. And finally, so about the Sharq al-Awsat, I do know the Sharq al-Awsat doesn't represent the general Arab public opinion in the Arab world. But if you look at some pan-Arab the Arabic newspapers, there's we may say three: Al-Haya, Al-Sharq al-Awsat, and the Al-Quds al-Arabi. And then the Sharq al-Awsat has the best website and archives, so that's where I can find some of the materials I can analyze. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Seo. I have one question here, and then I got to go back to this side. Yeah, at the back there. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for Dr. Mahmood. Sir, the domestic sources of continuity in Iranian foreign policy, behavior, concerning struggle for power between Ali Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, and the removal of Muttaqi as foreign minister and Saleh being brought in. Do you see this as part of the continuity or the struggle for power between these two centers of power? Does it also mean a change in Iran's nuclear policy with Saleh coming as foreign minister, or it will be a continuation during Ali Sultan's regime, heading the talks? You also talked about future. The chief of staff of Ahmadinejad, who is also a potential presidential candidate, how do you see foreign policy during his regime in case if he is replacing Ahmadinejad? To Dr. Cole, I was not very clear about Bahrain, what you are actually aiming at, whether it is a challenge or an opportunity. Given what Rafsanjani and Khatami did to repair ties with Saudi Arabia and other GCC states, are we going to see a renewal of Cold War between Tehran, or say, let's see Saudi Arabia in the Gulf in the immediate aftermath of the 79 revolution? Will things deteriorate to that extent? Lastly, to Dr. Jeongmin, of course, Sharq al-Awsat is supported by Saudi funds, we all know. But there was an American poll which suggested that majority of the Arabs support a nuclear weapon power Iran. How do you see this as a reflection between the Arab masses and the ruling elites, the contradiction in this? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I was told by our floor manager that I have not given the microphone to certain people on this side. So I have to wait a while to come back to you, yeah? Let me show some respect to my Professor Hudson. And then, yeah, he made me study Arabic and about the Middle East and destroy my career. So, okay, Professor Hudson, and then there are two other hands here, one lady here, and is there one more there?
There's one over here.
Okay. Oh yeah, I know, but I was told that this cluster of hands have been up for some time before I go back there. Okay,
well,
quickly.
This is very embarrassing. I should pull rank, but in a much more subtle way. That, at any rate, I had a couple of questions for Professor Mahmood. A couple of things. First of all, you indicated toward the end of your remarks that a post-ideological Iran might go in a certain direction, and I wasn't clear from what you had said how or when or whether Iran actually might get to a post-ideological condition. I wondered if you could elaborate on that. And for Professor Mahmood or others, I'm curious to know whether, especially in Iran itself, do people feel that time is on their side in terms of developing and expanding Iran's influence or even hegemony in the region, or on the contrary, do they feel that they're kind of on the defensive? A number of years ago, certainly after the Islamic Revolution, there was a sense that we used to call the new Iranian regime a game changer that wanted to really, redraw the whole map of regional politics and so on and so on. And I'm curious now whether, as you look at things that have happened, both positive and negative, I should think, from an Iranian point of view, whether they feel that they're gaining, that they're being more successful in containing America and the pro-American camp, or whether, on the contrary, they're feeling rather more squeezed. And to that end, just echoing a couple of points for Dr. So, naturally, one wonders if there's any part of public opinion in the Arab world that actually is favorable toward Iran or Iranian politics. And I think, as you've already indicated, or others have indicated, clearly sampling only from Sharq al-Awsat is probably not going to represent broader and perhaps contrary feelings. I don't know if you had examined al-Quds al-Arabi, whether, for example, it might look different. Just a question. Yes.
Ms. Gwen?
Thank you for this fine panel. To Juan and Mahmood, how are Iranian elites and publics responding to this idea of a GCC +2, inclusive of Morocco and Jordan? Is it perceived as a threat, to use your words, Juan, or is it mere rhetoric?
Thank you. Maybe I should take this gentleman's hand. Last, somebody can pass the microphone to this gentleman right in the front. He has put out his hand for some time already.
Yeah, okay. We've been waiting for too long for the microphone to get to this side.
Apologies.
Just a couple of quick questions. One is has to do with the emerging landscape, the future landscape, and Iran's role in it. There is a talk or the possibility that of a new axis in the regional politics, composed of Tehran, Cairo, Baghdad axis. Does that strike you as being really possible, and is that something that you would, as panelists, would like to comment on? At the moment, we know that there is Tehran, Syria, but as Syria weakens, and probably Egypt and Iran have this rapprochement together, the possibility for this axis, is that any possibility, and how is that going to be shaping the landscape of the future Middle East? The second question is to Dr. Cole. You have listed neatly the opportunities and the challenges, but you have not come with a score, final score, on balance. If you take the opportunities and the challenges, is Iran better off, or is Iran worse off as a result of the events that has taken place? I want really a concise answer, if you could address. Is Iran better off, or is Iran worse off? And I hope you don't give me any ambiguity in this. I really want a clear answer to that.
Ambiguity is the name of the game.
I know that. I want to stay from that, if possible.
Thank you, sir.
And can I just ask one more question of my dear friend Mahmood, the Sariolghalam? Dr. Hudson mentioned the post. You did talked about post-ideologically Iran. Is that similar to the post-revolutionary Iran? And is that in the making anytime soon? Is that a negation of this whole system? You've been talking about this Iran emerging as a more liberal state. But that has not happened in the past 20 years since I have first heard you, if you remember, probably in Italy, in Rome, when we were together. Finally, I think again, on balance, I think all the conclusion that Dr. Su has come with, I think is just completely misleading, because you have taken the Sharq al-Awsat. We know what the Sharq al-Awsat is. There is no excuse for you to say the archive is not there. If you go to al-Quds al-Arabi, they have even a better archive, by the way, than Sharq al-Awsat, which extends way beyond 2005. And al-Quds al-Arabi is exactly the opposite on the opposite ideological spectrum of the Sharq al-Awsat. So your finding is definitely misleading if you generalize this to the entire Arab media. It's just not representative one way or the other. Thank you very much.
All right, panel, we go with Dr. Ko again.
All right. Well, with regard to the question from Dr. Pasha about Bahrain and whether it's a challenge or an opportunity, which I think is also being brought up here, it is a challenge. It's a challenge because I think from an Iranian point of view, the Bush era was a positive in the sense that the the Iranian Revolution had been kept out of the Middle East, and it had been kept out of the Middle East by an alliance of conservative monarchies and Arab nationalist states, with Saddam Hussein's being on the front line. And a bulwark had been put up that, in fact, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards commander about 4 or 5 years ago gave a speech in which he said, we felt like we were excluded from the Middle East. And now, who could live without Beirut? So they felt as though this was a positive. There was a negative, that they were surrounded on two sides by a very large number of U.S. troops, and they wanted them gone. But I think they felt as though Saddam fell, was replaced by a Shiite-dominated government, that momentum was on their side. They became heroes in much of the Arab world for their stance in the 2006 and 2008-9 Israeli wars on Hezbollah and then Hamas and Gaza. So I think they felt like they were on a roll, and I think the Saudis were very, very unhappy about this roll. And we know, Saud Faisal came to New York in 2005 and lambasted the Bush administration, said, we fought a war back in the 1980s to stop this from happening, and then you just gave Iraq away on a silver platter to the Iranians. And that was how it was perceived in Riyadh. I see what happened in Bahrain as the Saudis drawing a line in the sand. They're sort of, the Shiites got Baghdad. They have increasingly, the new government in Lebanon is going to be very heavily influenced by Hezbollah. Where the Saudis and the Iranians are in competition, the Iranians have been winning, and thus far and no more. They're just going to stop it right there with, and the Saudis, had a relatively behind-the-scenes, quiet, almost timid foreign policy, and now all of a sudden, Saudi troops in another country. This is a big turning point, and I think in the modern Middle Eastern diplomacy. So this, from an Iranian point of view, they've run up against a wall, and they're very, very unhappy about it. So I think it's definitely perceived in Tehran as a challenge, and I think a more assertive Saudi Arabia, moreover, is certainly a detraction from potential Iranian influence in the region. Iran could see Saudi reassertion elsewhere where the two are in conflict with each other, in Lebanon and Iraq and elsewhere. On the whole and by and large, I think the Egyptian stance towards Iran, because Egypt was so distant, probably wasn't that important. So they have gained something in Cairo. They haven't gained a lot. The Iraq situation had already clarified by last fall. They had won again in helping to form the Iraqi government. So what's happened since December, I think, has largely been a negative for Iran. I think the Obama administration has managed to make the United States much more popular than it was. If you think about Iranian foreign policy as above all anti-imperial, and then subsidiarily based on reaching out to local clients, then I think in both cases they've lost something in recent months.
Dr. Mahmood?
Yeah. I'll start with Dr. Pasha. The political standoffs and infighting over the last month or so were not over policy issues. They were basically over administrative differences, personal conflicts, and some of the outstanding constitutional interpretations that have been with Iran over the last 30 years. It's basically over division of labor, who should be doing what in what area. So it's not over policy. Now, second, Iran's nuclear policy making process, for the most part, is beyond the presidency. it's at a much higher level of decision-making apparatus. So no matter who becomes president and what the nature of the inner circle of a given president may be, the nuclear policy making is shaped, defined, pursued at a much higher level. We have another exactly 2 years till the next presidential election, June 2013. It is far too early to speculate on who might be the contenders. It is my guess that it is going to be beyond the entourage of the current administration, given the squabbles that we have been witnessing over the last year or so. On Professor Hudson's question that may also resonate what Dr. Abdul Qadir said, I'm looking basically at the patterns in the Iranian society and how they're going to change the nature of Iranian politics in the next decade or so. By year 2023, as the estimates tell us, Iran's population will be over 100 million people. At that time, if we have the current economic policies that the country is pursuing, Iran's oil production and income will be less than UAE and Iraq. So with 100+ population, fewer national resources, and the #1 brain drain in the world, the country, and most likely with a different generation of politicians in the country, because most individuals are either in their 70s or we have also a few in their 80s, one would speculate that the country will be forced, not so much that it will have to take one of the alternatives, it will be forced into making decisions on soft politics rather than hard politics. Iran's extension into the region is a reflection of its revolutionary legacy. And once Iran is forced to focus on its domestic issues, Iran's reach into the region will be far less than the current policies. It has always been difficult for those of us who live inside Iran, witnessing the high levels of inefficiencies of the state, to accept the argument of the Shia crescent or the expansionist Iran. So I think that's going to be a much an argument with much less vitality in the coming years or so. So when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen, I think we need to look at the Iranian society, especially over the last 3-4 years, as you have witnessed some of the momentum in the country. How Iranians view the GCC+2, I think at the elite level, at the level of the establishment, the political establishment, especially security military, GCC is an extension of American hegemony in the region from their perception. At the public level, I may astonish you by saying that an absolute majority of Iranians are indifferent to the country's foreign policy direction and involvement. And 87% of the air traffic of Iran is to Western Europe and North America. There is very, very little interest in Iran towards expanding relations with Asia. And Iran's relations with China is basically through Dubai, the rechanneling of Chinese goods and commodities to Iran. Most of the Chinese companies will deal with Iran through their Dubai affiliates. So I think at the public level, there is very, very little interest in regional issues. And substantiating on that, I think there is a feeling that Iran, at the public level, that Iran doesn't really belong to this region. It's a unique country with a unique past and with its own language, literature, geography. And I think you can find that in the, especially among the educated, the newly educated young people in the country, who have more interest in the West than in the region and regional issues. I'll just give you my take on Tehran, Baghdad, and Cairo. I would say that despite the new momentum in Iranian-Egyptian relations, it will not go too far. There might be an embassy in both countries, but there are outstanding issues beyond security between the two countries. And there is no consensus in the two countries on how to proceed with a functioning relationship. With Iraq, I think interests are basically security and some export of commodities. So I just see very little momentum inside Iran and the diplomatic capacity to create such an axis between Iran, Egypt, and Iraq, let alone the problems that are in the way between Iraq and Egypt itself. So I think it is it's a kind of a romantic thinking, but I don't think it will materialize. I think I did mention some ideas about the future of this post-ideology era in Iran, and I would look at the patterns, and you need to also realize that the government in Iran over the last 6 years has come from the most ideological sectors of the Iranian establishment, and in the process they have changed. They have changed and they have their own policy differences within them. So I would look at generational issues rather than debates within Iran in determining the nature of the country in the future.
Dr. Shio?
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for the criticisms on the reliability of my sources. Yes, I do agree with you. Yes, if I, analyzed, the editorials of the Qudus al-Arabis, the result may be somewhat different. The Abdul Bari Atwan, doesn't like, my, some result, of course, But, what I want to, know, ultimately, the established opinion, which has more influence on the policy level, not the public sentiment, not the opinions from the Islamist or opposition groups. So actually, finally, in my diagram, I want to focus on some Arab governments are they have announced the plan of the nuclear development. It's very some political gesture. So it's some just reflecting some the issues of the Iranian the threat. So I want to focus on the policy level of the opinion, or so that's what I finally the chose to analyze the Sharq al-Awsat. I do agree. So after all, overall, I do agree with your the suggestions or the problems in sources. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shio. I want to just say a few words before I wrap up this interesting panel. First of all, I agree with Dr. Mahmood that most Iranians in the streets in his country don't really look at Southeast Asia or Asia. Only in the last 2 years, maybe a bit more, because so many Chinese goods are inundating the market area, the bazaar. But politically and strategically, Iran is still very much within the Middle East Gulf region. Coming over to Southeast Asia, perhaps some bit of Islamic zeal, but because most of the people in this part of the world are not Shiites, so I feel that they have some difficulties articulating a posture of intensifying Iranian presence in this region. However, having said that, I must tell you that there are very serious concerns in many countries in Southeast Asia, even in East Asia, with regard to the activities related to terrorism perpetrated by some elements of the militia and revolutionaries in Iran. In the case of Singapore, we have good relations with Iran. Iranians are active here in this country. We see several Iranian companies here, big companies, the Iranian shipping line, the oil company, the petrochemical, all these national companies are here in Singapore. But I must also tell you that we are constantly being scrutinized by the international community on the activities of these companies in Singapore. But so far, Singapore has tried to maintain its open port, warm hospitality, and hopefully our Iranian friends will reciprocate by just engage in business and not get into some of the more tricky activities that arouse many people's attention. Trade between Iran and Singapore is about $3 billion US dollars annually. It has gone up a little bit because of the increase in the price of oil. Yeah. We almost, the whole chunk of $3 billion is almost devoted exclusively to oil products from Iran. So we buy a lot more than we can sell. We can't sell very much because our trading companies and financial companies are not able to deal with the financial transaction as a result of the sanctions against Iran. But Iranian people are coming here. We get about 25,000 Iranian tourists every year. And what is interesting is that there are many Iranian students now studying here in our universities, and also private schools where they want to pick up more knowledge of the English language or sciences, and then they can connect with their friends around the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is just a very brief snapshot. I hope you have benefited from Dr. Koh's broad sweep of the relations between Iran and the region. And then Dr. Mahmood tried to drill down a bit more into the specific aspects of Iranian foreign policy behavior. And Dr. Shio has bravely illustrated some of his research to put across the point about Iran's nuclear ambitions. Very few of us know where it will go about the nuclear ambition, but definitely we are all watching very closely and hope that these kind of activities will not endanger the peace and stability in the region. On that note, thank you very much and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you, Ambassador Ong and the rest of our panelists. And just to expand on the ambassador's remark, there's also a Facebook group for Iranians in Singapore, which I am a member of. Before you go off to your lunch, I just want to make some logistical points so that you can digest your food with ease. There is a prayer room just beside the lunch hall, and so please feel free anytime. I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier in the conference. We will break out again after lunch into 2 sessions. Asians living and working in the Gulf will take place in this room, and Whither the GCC will take place right above us. And I do want to reiterate, we are very much looking forward to the concert this evening with the legendary Marcel Khalife. Buses will be leaving here at 6:40 p.m., and there will be a free flow of Tiger beer, thanks to our sponsors, Asia Pacific Breweries, and Lebanese food to go with it. Buses will depart from the conservatory to the Shangri-La, or if you wish to continue celebrating in the after party, there will be a bus going to Anar Lebanese Restaurants and Tosa Resorts, and that bus will come back to the Shangri-La at 1 a.m. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy your lunch.